I'm going to keep it at 100 and then I'll click OK. And now it automatically adjusts this sample to make it 100% quantized. Hi everyone, Sam Smyers here. I'm an artist and music producer in Los Angeles, California. Today I want to talk to you about how to warp samples in Ableton Live. I used to be a Logic Pro user, but then eventually I switched to Ableton Live because the warp capabilities are incredible. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. Now, let's warp some samples. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to check the preferences for warping samples whenever I drag these samples in. So we go to the preferences and this record warp launch section. Right here we see the warp section. It says loop, warp, short samples. So whenever I drag in a short sample, it'll automatically warp that sample. So if I have, right now I have a tempo of 106, and I have a sample that is 128, really short, it'll just automatically set it to 106. Auto warp long samples, same thing. If I turn this on, if I take in a long sample that might be like 30 seconds long, it'll auto warp it to whatever the session tempo is. The default warp mode, that is whenever I drag in a sample and the warp mode is turned on that sample, it defaults to beats. I can change it to tones, texture, repitch, or complex. And then also there is an option to create fades on clip edges. So whenever I drag in a sample, it will automatically create fades on the clip edges, and you can turn that on or off. I usually have this off because if I drag in a kick sample, then I don't want to fade at the beginning of that kick sample because it will take off some of the transient of that kick. So let's go ahead and drag in a sample. Let's go ahead and drag in this happy loop, guitar loop. I'll just copy it to clipboard and then Command V. Now see, this is 106 and my session BPM is 106. So if I double click on this sample, this warp segment BPM is already set to 106, so it should be in time with my session. So let's go through some of these functions here. Right here is the warp button. As you can see, it is turned on. If I turn it off, there's no warp happening. So if I change the tempo of the session, then the tempo of this sample will stay the same. If I turn it on, then when I change the tempo of the session to 100, for example, the sample will change the tempo along with the session tempo. So as you can hear, it's still in time. If I take it down to 80, it's still in time. The next button is follower or leader. I've actually never used this because what it is used for is you can set a clip to be a leader, and only one sample can be a leader at a time. And basically that means that whatever BPM this clip is set at, then the whole session will be set at that BPM. So it turns off the whole session BPM. See right here, it's inactive when I have this leader on because the BPM is being set to whatever this clip BPM is. So say my session is at 80 BPM and then it gets to this clip, it'll switch to 106 BPM because that is what this clip is set at. So you can see how it was at 80 and then it jumped to 106. So I've never had any use for that. The next thing we have is a segment BPM. This is the BPM of the sample. This sample was tagged with 106, so we know it's 106. And when you want to adjust this manually, put your cursor over it and then just type in some numbers. So I can type in 80 and then hit enter. I can type in 100 and then enter. And that is how you set the segment BPM. Sometimes when you drag in a sample, it's not always correct. Ableton doesn't always correctly identify the BPM, so that is how you change the BPM to match the BPM of your sample. Right here is divide or times. So you can see it says divide to times 2. If I drag in a sample and it tags it at 80 BPM, but the sample is actually 160 BPM, for example, samples that have to do with like hip hop, that happens a lot, then I can hit times 2 and then it times the BPM by 2, or I can divide it by 2 and it divides the BPM by 2. So let's play it. So that's halftime. So right here we have the warp modes. I currently have it set on beats. This is generally good for percussive material like drums. There is an option right here that says preserve. Ableton recommends that you generally just leave this on transients, especially if you're using percussive material, but you can experiment with any of these other different options. Next we have tones. This is good for monophonic instruments like a bass guitar or possibly vocals. Next we have texture. Texture is good for things such as atmospheric pads. Next we have repitch, which changes the playback of the sample. So it actually will change the pitch of the sample according to the BPM. So this BPM is 212, the session BPM is 106. If I play it back, it's going to sound really low and slow. And listen to what happens when I change the segment BPM. So I can hear the playback of the sample changed length, and so did the pitch. Next we have complex mode, and then after that we have complex pro. So these are usually what I am using if I am going to be warping a sample like guitar. Let's go ahead and listen to complex. So that sounds pretty cool. It's all slowed down right now because I have it essentially at halftime. Let's go complex pro. So that sounds even better than complex. And it has the options right here to change the envelope or the format. And just test this out, see how it sounds with the sample. It really depends on the sample that you're using and what kind of sound you're going for. The next thing, let's go over here. We have edit, which this is if you want to edit the sample in an external sample editor, which I don't have. So I'm going to hit cancel. I don't do that. Next, we have save. If I make any changes to the sample, then I can save it. We have reverse, which reverses the sample. If I hit this, it reverses it almost immediately. So that's pretty cool. I can also just hit R whenever I'm in the session. Right here, I can just hit R, and then it just reverses it like that really fast. Next, we have high Q. This is high quality. This processes the sample in a more high quality way than if it's turned off. This works well, especially if I'm transposing the sample up or down. Right now, it's not transposed. It's just playing at the same pitch that I took it into. So this is 0 semitones. If I pitch it up, we can listen to it. And so I'm just hitting the up arrow on the keyboard to make it go up. And I can also make it go down by hitting the down arrow on the keyboard. I can also just click on it and enter in a number on the keyboard. So I can hit in 6, and it goes up 6 semitones. I can hit -6, and it goes down 6 semitones. If I double click on it, it'll go back to 0. This detune is a more finer pitch adjustment, this is 0 cents right here. So I can drag it up or down. I can also enter in the number I want on the keyboard. So I can do -20. I can do 20. And I'm just typing in numbers on the keyboard to adjust that. The next thing that we have is the volume of the sample, and I can adjust that by dragging this up and down, or I can also just see right there, I just double clicked it and it went back to 0. I can also just enter in how much gain I want to add or take away. So let's do 6 and I'll do 6 dB. Just double click on that to reset it. The next thing we have is this RAM right here. Now what this does is it loads the sample into your computer's memory instead of reading it off of your computer's hard drive. This is useful if you have a lot of CPU overload. You can try loading some samples into the RAM. It might not work too well if you don't have a lot of memory. So just try this out with some samples if you're overloading your CPU and see if that helps at all. So I put the BPM back at 106, and when I drag it in the sample, Ableton analyzed some transients where it thinks there are transients with these little markers right here. And you can see as I drag it up here, it gives me little suggestions of where I can place a warp marker. If I want to adjust something in this sample, I can double click and it will create a warp marker. So right there, I can create a warp marker right there. And if I want to drag this forward, see it's a little early, so I can drag this forward, then I need to put a marker on each side so that it doesn't change the rest of the sample. So if I drag it forward, see this stays the same, and then everything before it also stays the same. I'm gonna double click and take those off. If I did not have markers on each side, then when I drag this, it will take the entire sample forward or back. And you usually don't want that if you're just trying to make a small little change if something in the sample is out of time. One more thing with these warp markers, if I need to adjust the warp marker and I don't want it to adjust exactly to the grid, then I can hit Option, hold down Option, and then drag the warp marker and adjust it however much I want. So that is a way to do it manually, to manually adjust or warp your sample. There's another way to do it by just quantizing it. Now, if I do Command A, then I can do Shift Command U, and I can select how I want to quantize this sample. I can do to 1/8, 1/16, 1/32. I'm just going to do to 1/8, and then I'm going to pick how much quantization I want. I'm going to keep it at 100, and then I'll click OK. And now it automatically adjusts this sample to make it 100% quantized. So I find this great for recording guitar and making quick quantization edits. Sometimes it doesn't work, as you can see here. I don't think it actually quantized this thing perfectly right here. So we'd probably just have to edit that manually. A lot of times it works though really well. I can also loop the sample, and I can choose the length of the sample loop by adjusting this bar right here at the top and then hitting this loop button. So you can see it just looped. And so I'm going to turn that loop off. I can also adjust the length of the entire sample by moving this arrow right here. If I look in the session at the sample and I adjust this arrow, we can see that the length of the whole sample changes. So if I only want this first part and I don't want to loop it, then I just created this one little clip. There you have it. That is how you warp samples in Ableton Live. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Thank you so much.